One of the most common questions I get is, Argent, I'm interested in Star Wars. I want to read some stuff from the extended universe. I want to read some stuff from canon. I don't like the reboot. The reboot's terrible. All the movies in the reboot are awful. So show us some good canon stuff. Let us kind of what would you recommend to get into the lore of Star Wars, to go beyond the movies, to kind of get into the bigger story? You always talk about all this cool stuff like the Imperial Civil War, Sith philosophy, etc. That sounds a lot more kind of esoteric and thematically interesting than garbage like Star Wars Rebels, where Thrawn gets beaten by space whales, the world between worlds, and just all the other nonsense that they insert into the reboot. So that being said, I put together a list of 10 books slash series that I would recommend starting if you want to find out more about the extended universe. So the criteria from this for this series is, A, it has to add something to the lore, something to kind of the main Star Wars timeline, because there's the movies, but then there's also a timeline in which one series of books leads to another until you get to the Yuzan Vong War and you start getting into the Legacy era. So it has to be something that adds to the lore, both in terms of the overall story and in terms of just, be it the philosophy, be it something like in Dark Empire where it adds a bunch of new ships like the Tector, the Allegiance, the Sovereign. It adds kind of some new ships or some new kind of philosophical stuff. Or just, like I said, expands the universe, makes it richer. It also has to be a good story on its own merit. If you don't even really know anything about Star Wars, or you don't know a ton about Star Wars, it has to be a book you can pick up and read and enjoy to make it onto this list. It has to be a story that stands on its own. So those are the criteria I have, so let's get into it. Now, this is not what I would consider canon. This is an honorable mention. This is from the reboot, but it's written by Timothy Zahn, so I do give it a bit of credibility, and I personally kind of combine whatever was in this that doesn't contradict Thrawn's original backstory. Most of this could easily be extrapolated to Thrawn as we know him within the canon, like the Thrawn trilogy, the Thrawn duology. I don't think it directly kind of goes against that, and it really expands the role of the character. So Thrawn is just an all-around excellent book. It's written by Timothy Zahn, who also wrote the Thrawn trilogy and the Thrawn duology. So it's his character. It's not something being given to C-grade hacks. They're giving it to the person who made the character of Thrawn. And he really got complete creative freedom to really delve into the character in more depth. There's also a lot of really good side characters. I'm a huge fan of Eli Vanto, who's Thrawn's sidekick. He's from Wild Space, which is the edge of the known galaxy. And they gave him kind of a hillbilly kind of southern accent in the audiobook to reflect this. I'd recommend all of these in audiobook format. Some of them, they overly abridge them, but the Star Wars audiobooks are very different from other audiobooks. They always have music, they always have sound effects. They'll often have multiple narrators. And sometimes, as with the Dark Empire books, they actually got Billy D. Williams to come back and play Lando. It's the story of Thrawn from his very humble beginnings as a exile on a random planet, how he's found by the Empire, how he goes from being the very lowest rank in society, not only a second lieutenant, but an alien in a xenophobic culture. And you get to see his rise, his rapid promotion. It's just a brilliantly done novel. Timothy Zahn really gets Thrawn. Throughout the book, you just see one brilliant plan after another, kind of this Wile E. Coyote, Sherlock Holmesy mixture that's just utterly fascinating to watch. Timothy Zahn is truly one of the great masters of Star Wars writing, and I highly recommend the novel Thrawn. Tarkin is also not bad, but to me it's just not as nearly as good as the Thrawn novel is. Next, as an honorable mention, we have Shadows of the Empire, which is one of the more mainstream ones. There's a couple extended universe novels that people might have heard of, and Shadows of the Empire was one of them. The other major one, I guess, is the Thrawn trilogy, and that's probably the next one people have heard of, and then maybe Dark Empire after that. Shadows of the Empire was a multimedia project. Obviously, there was the video game. There was also a book version of it. and it takes place between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And it's interesting because it's more from the villain perspective. I mean, Leia and Luke are the main characters, but Zyzer also. Zyzer is the head of Black Sun and probably the second wealthiest man in the galaxy, who has a deep rivalry with Darth Vader. He's constantly trying to embarrass Darth Vader to get the Emperor's favor, etc. And it really goes a lot into his character, and he's kind of fascinating. And it's cool to have the story take place on Coruscant. It's cool to see more of the Empire. And it's a really good use of Luke and Leia. Leia's kind of conflicted because she's in love with Han, but she's also wondering how much of that was just kind of spur of the moment. There's a part of it where she kind of meditates on the whole I love you, I know thing and goes, what the hell does that mean? And she's unsure of it. You also have Zyzer trying to seduce her. It's just a fun book. It's a good kind of spy novel. Why it's not in the top 10 is I just don't think it's as good as the others on this list, or just not, to me, as relevant to the core plot of Star Wars. But I definitely recommend. So now we're going to get into the actual top 10. With the exception of probably the top 2, which is definitely the order I would put them in, and are definitely, in my view, the best Star Wars books, and also some of the best books I've ever read. The order for this is very loose. It was very difficult because a lot of these are different genre. Like some of them are more military, some of them are fantasy, some of them are more action. It really depends a lot, and it's very hard to rank them. Also, they were written over a long period of time. I've mentioned that Dark Empire is on this list. That was 1991, so it's very 90s, whereas some of the other books on this list were written in the 2000s. So the writing style is very different, and so it's kind of hard to directly compare. The Black Fleet Crisis is really interesting because the Empire aren't the villains for once. In this case, it's the Yavitha, also known as the Duskin League. So the Yavitha were previously a group of slaves the Empire had, and they were being used to work for a advanced Imperial fleet called Black Sword Command. The Yavitha had an uprising, though, and they turned the tide and they enslaved the Imperials, and they captured an entire Imperial battle fleet, including an Executor-class Super Star Destroyer called the Intimidator, which they renamed to be the Pride of Yavitha. So, over the course of the novels, they launch a genocidal campaign to exterminate all the other species in their galaxy. This is in their sector of space. So this is during a time when Leia is the chief of state, and we get to see her kind of break down and have a lot of trouble trying to deal with the stresses of her position. We get to see Han really in a good supportive husband role in this. I think they give him like a desk job for a little while so he can take over raising the kids, which doesn't really bother me because he's Han Solo. He doesn't need to prove his masculinity to anybody. So yeah, that happens, and we get to see it's just a very interesting political conflict. The problem with the Black Fleet Crisis is both of the side plots are terrible, although we do get to see a lot of Chewie, and we get to see the other Wookiees, and that's pretty cool. But Luke's quest for his mother is terrible, and the random ship that Lando comes across is really lame too. So the main plot is really interesting. It's kind of something different, but the side plots are pretty awful. So this one's kind of a mixed bag. I'd still probably recommend it, though. Number 10, Crimson Empire. Now, Crimson Empire was a comic book. I listened to the audiobook version of it. That's kind of another unique thing about... I guess they do it in other contexts, but kind of one of the interesting things about Star Wars is they do audiobook versions of the comics, which is really nice because Dark Empire is a comic, Crimson Empire is a comic, and there's a bunch of others, and it kind of gives access to somebody who might not have a way to get the comic or doesn't like reading comics. So Crimson Empire is something that happens directly within the Star Wars timeline. So this is after the final death of Palpatine and after the end of Operation Shadowhand. Imperial Guardsman Karnor Jax, along with the Imperial Ruling Council, succeeded in sabotaging all of Palpatine's clones, leading to his final death. Karnor Jax then seized control of the Empire, and it became known as the Crimson Empire because he still wore his Imperial Guard armor. So it's interesting because this is the last, until we get to the Imperial Remnant, this is kind of the last successor state to the centralized empire. And kind of once Karnor Jax dies, the Empire as it existed ceases to kind of be relevant. So the story is told primarily from Kyrkanos' perspective. Kyrkanos is another Imperial Guard, specifically the last loyal one. Cardor Jax is able to kill off the remainder of the Imperial Guard. As the last loyal Imperial Guard, the other guards cover his escape so he can go and avenge the Emperor. So the whole story is Kyrkanos' quest to defeat Cardor Jax and to avenge the death of his master. Now what makes this so interesting is Kyrkanos is a villain protagonist. He obviously is because he serves Palpatine, who's kind of basically the villain of the entire Star Wars franchise. But Kyrkanos is an immensely honorable man, and his loyalty is very admirable. He also teams up with the rebels, and we get an awesome cameo from Wedge, who shows up in the Lusagia and kicks major ass. But Kyrkanos is just a badass. There's like a scene in the book where he destroys a TIE fighter with his blaster. He's a Force user, so he fires his blaster. He manages to hit the window on the front of the TIE fighter. It goes straight through and kills the pilot. And it's one of the most badass things I've ever seen. He puts on his armor and just fights a whole bunch of stormtroopers, etc. So he's kind of a very sympathetic villain protagonist. We also get kind of insights into how the Imperial Guard, I know they're called the Royal Guard, but Imperial Guard sounds cooler. How the Imperial Guard are trained, kind of some insights into their lives. It's fascinating. Villain protagonists are always cool. Next, we have the X-Wing novels. So the X-Wing novels are a lengthy collection of novels that cover every era of Star Wars. From Rogue Squadron 1, which is just after the proclamation of the New Republic, 5 or 6 months after the defeat of the Empire at Endor, also the fall of Coruscant, the Bacta War, the Krytos virus. You also have Iron Fist. You have the Hunt for Zinj kind of trilogy. And you have Isard's Revenge, which is the invasion of the Citric hegemony. So they kind of cover the entire series. They're very much based on the movie Top Gun. And it covers it from a much more of a military perspective. So you get to see kind of X-Wings. You get to see how small ships defeat large ships. There's kind of, particularly the Bacta War deals with a lot of hit and run stuff. There's just a lot of great stuff in these books. Not only does it bring back Wedge from the movies, but you get a variety of other cool side characters, or I guess kind of main characters. You have Corran Horn, who's kind of the main character of them. You have Tycho Selko. I know I'm butchering some of these. Mirax, Tarek, Booster Tarek. You just have a wide variety of people from different backgrounds, and they kind of come together in this ragtag group. You, of course, have Isard as the main villain of the first 4 novels, but you also have Zinj. It just kind of provides a bit more of a ground-level view of some of the great conflicts in galactic history. And reading the stuff about Isard is kind of critical for understanding what happened immediately after Endor. It also deals with the fall of Coruscant to the New Republic. So I'd highly recommend the X-Wing novels. They're just a lot of fun. The audiobooks are not particularly good, though. So this one's going to be controversial considering how low it is on this list, the Thrawn trilogy. Now, this is the one that most people would recommend as kind of where to start in the extended universe. It's generally considered excellent, and there's a lot of good aspects to it. There's Thrawn, Jehoras C'baoth, the insane clone Dark Jedi. This is where we first meet Mara Jade. With regards to Mara Jade, your mileage may vary. Some people love her. Some people think she's a Mary Sue. This is where we get Gilad Pellaeon. This is where we get Talon Card, Garm Bel Iblis. So there's a lot of great characters we introduce. I love Garm Bel Iblis because he's just kind of like a crotchety old man. Gilad Pellaeon, I did a whole video on him, is one of my all-time favorite characters in the Star Wars universe. Thrawn is too. So why is this not higher on the list? Because it's kind of a mess. Now, the problem with these books is they came out at around the same time as Dark Empire. And this takes place pretty close to Dark Empire. For the events of Dark Empire, Thrawn had his campaign, and then he died, and immediately after his death, it began pre-Shadowhand, where they retook Coruscant, and then he revealed himself to the wider galaxy. The problem is because these two were written at the same time, they kind of contradict each other. Like one of the big problems here is Mara Jade, the Emperor's Hand, doesn't show up in Dark Empire, but she doesn't show up because she wasn't really added into the canon beforehand. So you kind of have a case where Dark Empire doesn't reference the Thrawn trilogy, and the Thrawn trilogy doesn't reference Dark Empire, despite the fact that they're both extremely critical to the timeline. They're like two of the biggest post movie events. And there's just kind of a lot of contradictions with them not referencing one another. So that's kind of a big issue with it. Also, the other problem is Thrawn himself. Now, Thrawn is an excellently written character. He's fascinating. He kind of, unlike most of the Imperials, he's a lot more sympathetic. Jarek, in one of the Dark Forces novels, says, "There's no evil in you, Thrawn, only calculation." He's a lot more... Thrawn is kind of a ruthless pragmatist. He's very much against wasting resources, unnecessary civilian casualties. He hates super weapons. The problem is, by making a really sympathetic Imperial character who doesn't have the same flaws as, say, Palpatine or Tarkin, their sadism, their arrogance, their kind of unwillingness to compromise on even basic issues, which makes everyone want to kill them. The fact that he doesn't have any of these means that they have to deal with him in a lamer way. Because Palpatine's repeated deaths grow directly out of flaws in his personality, and they make sense. The same thing with Tarkin, the same thing with Isard, the same thing with all the other Imperial leaders, up to Pelion, who manages to succeed because he doesn't have the same personality. Thrawn doesn't, so ultimately they have to beat him through some of the worst plot armor I've ever seen. It didn't make a lot of sense. What would have kind of fixed his death is if it had have turned out that Palpatine orchestrated it, which is my headcanon, because otherwise it's so lame. It's just nonsensical. Because Thrawn was basically about to win and overthrow the New Republic, and in this lame side plot, his bodyguard winds up killing him. The ending really knocks it down a couple pegs, and the fact that you had all this build-up with no payoff is kind of my big issue with the Thrawn trilogy. I'd still recommend it, but it has a lot of issues. Next, we have the Thrawn duology, which is kind of Timothy Zahn's... It happens a bit further in the future. This happens after Dark Empire, after reunification, after the Imperial skirmishes. This is the last novel to take... The last two novels, Spectre of the Past and Vision of the Future, to take place within the Galactic Civil War. In the second novel in the series, Vision of the Future, the Bastion Accords is signed, which ends the Galactic Civil War. So the war that began in A New Hope is finally ended. And it's pretty cool to just see the final kind of resolution of it. And I think the resolution is very well done. We get to see in these books Pelion finally accepting the inevitable, going around and bullying the various Moths and trying to accept it. We see some of the Moth Dizra and kind of his cabal of the hardliners trying to kind of orchestrate a coup against Pelion, trying to continue the war despite the fact that it's been lost. And it kind of reminds you of the hardliner coup in the dying days of the Soviet Union. And Pelion's kind of the Boris Yeltsin who stands up and manages to finally bring about peace. And we see the end of this extremely long war that lasted, I think, like nearly 2 decades. The entire Galactic Civil War went on for. And we get to see it, and I think it's a very satisfying conclusion. So we get that. We also get the Kamasi document crisis, which I don't really have time to get into, but it's another kind of fascinating political conflict that threatens to tear apart the New Republic, and it kind of shows the weaknesses of their multicultural kind of decentralized society. There's a lot of benefits to it, but there's also a lot of drawbacks. And we see the Kamasi document crisis start to drive systems back to the Empire. However, it's nowhere near, it's too little too late. We also see Luke Skywalker finally get married when he proposes to Mara Jade. And we have the Thrawn clone, and it introduces the Empire of the Hand. Just a ton of stuff happens in these 2 books. I love the political and intrigue. I love the kind of the spy aspects of it. They're absolutely great. It also has one of my favorite quotes in Star Wars. It's been a long, difficult, hard road for all of us, sir, but mostly for you. Which is what Pelion's second command says to him. We get a cool scene in it where Pelion basically just levels a small fleet through his superior skills he picked up from Thrawn without taking any losses, which is awesome to see how he's grown as a character. Part of why I love him so much is he continued to grow as a character despite his advanced age. He was like 60 or whatever when he became Thrawn's second in command, and he was able to completely go from being the most conservative officer in the Imperial Navy to being very innovative and creative in his tactics, which I find fascinating. Next, we have the Jedi Academy books, which are a lot of fun as well. This is where Luke finally establishes his Jedi Academy. There's no Kylo Ren on Yavin 4, which is kind of really interesting because I didn't really know anything about Yavin 4. So Exar Kun, as the book pronounces it, had kind of taken over Yavin 4, and he got the local people there to build him like all the pyramids and stuff. And the spirit of Exar Kun comes out and possesses one of Luke's students, and that's pretty cool. We also get Chewie and Han being sent to the mines of Kessel. So we get to see Kessel. This is where the Maw happens, where Fleet Admiral Dala is at the Maw installation, and she's developed these like other super weapons, specifically the Sun Crusher, which can blow up stars. So we get to endure Dala's hilariously awful campaigns. We get Han Solo and Leia a lot in it. We really start to kind of get a good look at their home life in this. What is, on the whole, a very successful marriage, unlike in the reboot. There's just so much good stuff in this book series. Dala's a lot of fun because of how inept she is, but how confident she is in her ineptitude. We get to see more Luke. Luke's always good. Han Solo and Chewie breaking out of Kessel is a lot of fun. This book, I just love this book trilogy. It's kind of a bit older and it has some issues with it, but it adds a lot to the Star Wars lore, and it's just very entertaining. Number 4, we have the courtship of Princess Leia, which is kind of unique in the Star Wars universe because it's a romance story. This is the novel in which Leia and Han finally get married, and it's fascinating because the Prince of the Hates Consortium, which is probably the largest non-aligned faction in the Star Wars universe. Almost everyone else is either part of the New Republic or the Empire. But their super attractive prince goes and proposes to Leia and gives her all these presents, and it's implied he's going to get a planet for the refugees from Alderaan to settle on. So she seems to be wavering. She looks like she's going to abandon Han to marry Princess Isildur. Han decides in alpha as fuck fashion that he's going to do something about this. If this fancy prince is going to offer her a planet, he's going to offer her a planet. So I'm not kidding. Han goes and takes out a massive loan against the Millennium Falcon, goes and wins hand after hand of Sabak, and wins a planet for Leia. How awesome is that? And it turns out to be Dathomir, which is even more awesome. So we get this road trip where Han kidnaps Princess Leia, and they go to Dathomir together, and then Luke and Isidore and kind of the rest of the cast wind up following them there. And Han's like, I'm going to make you love me. I'm going to kidnap you. We're going to stay on this planet until you wind up falling back in love with me again. Which is just so alpha. Like, kidnapping her and kind of... A lot of people hate this book because they say it's sexist. Me, I just say it's alpha and awesome. So they get to help the good Dathomiri witches fight the Night Sisters. This is also where we see the final death of Zinj and the destruction of his empire. So there's just a lot of fun stuff that happens in it. Probably my favorite scene is Luke goes full Jedi Master and flies the Valken by himself and uses his Force powers to control the quad cannon. We got Han trying to become a suicide bomber with a nuclear thermal detonator at one point. There's just a ton of fun in it. And it's kind of really a throwback to the adventure and excitement of the original movies. Also, like I said, it's Han and Leia finally get married and begin what will be an extremely successful marriage no matter what the crappy reboot tells you. Number 3, Dark Empire. So this one's going to be controversial because a lot of people hate Dark Empire. It's very divisive. So Dark Empire is the rebirth of Palpatine. In the aftermath of Thrawn, the various warlords succeed in reuniting and they retake Coruscant. What follows is an orgy of violence in which the various Imperials turn on each other and decimate their remaining forces. However, a mysterious signal from the deep core causes many ships to jump into hyperspace and head in that direction. It turns out that within the deep core on the throne world of Biss, which is an awesome name, Palpatine had a secret cloning facility, and using essence transfer, he's come back from the dead, piloting the new superstar dreadnought, the Eclipse, which is an awesome name and looks awesome and has a super laser like the Death Star, despite being a Star Destroyer. So, Palpatine coming back is awesome. I know it's kind of lame for him to come back from the dead, but this is an established thing in Star Wars, that powerful Force users can remain in this plane and not move on to the afterlife. It's also established that the Sith have the ability to transfer their consciousness between different vessels. This happened with Exar Kun's spirit within the Jedi Academy book. So this is a well-established thing. Plus, it's just cool to see Palpatine back again. And I think this doesn't do his character any disservice. I think it's kind of fascinating because on one hand, Palpatine's stronger than ever. On the other, the dark side has completely rotted his mind. The concept of the Dark Empire is an empire that would be ruled solely through the Force, and Palpatine would abandon traditional military forces. Operation Shadow Hand itself is very poorly planned and relies entirely on brute force. The Empire takes planet after planet, but rather than really occupy them and try to set up governance on them, they resort more often than not to just committing genocide against the various worlds they conquer. And they take horrible casualties even if they are winning. You can really see, it's like how someone described the later part of Napoleon's career. By this point, the best victories were behind him, and he relied solely on overwhelming force in order to get. So we get to see that in Palpatine. We get Luke briefly fall to the dark side, which was kind of interesting. We get to see Luke and Palpatine have a lightsaber duel, which is awesome. We get some cool new super weapons. We get the Galaxy Gun, which fires warp speed missiles, which is really cool. And I don't know why no one ever had that before or after. You have the Eclipse, you have the World Devastators, you have Han and Leia having their third child, Anakin Skywalker the second, which is awesome. We get Luke destroying a AT-AT with the Force. He crumples it like a ball of tinfoil, which is also awesome. Like I said, in the audiobook version, they get Billy D. Williams to come back and play Lando again. It's a fitting end, I think, for Palpatine's character. It's thematically really interesting because it provides a good kind of explanation. Why did the Empire finally lose? They had all these planets left, they had all these ships left, and kind of part of the irony is the only one who could unite the Empire was the Emperor. I mean, no duh. But where all the other warlords failed, Palpatine succeeded again, and they briefly all pledged allegiance to him. And it looked like they were going to win, but Palpatine's arrogance, his focus on winning Luke to the dark side, of being kind of blind to the affairs of state, and becoming increasingly unhinged as he took more and more of the dark side into himself, led to his downfall. In the space of less than a year, the Empire went from being completely resurgent and destroying basically the Republic at this point became the Rebel Alliance again, leaving an utterly depleted empire in which even if all the remaining forces were united under one banner, they would stand no chance of winning back the galaxy. So it has a lot of, I think, interesting thematic depth. It's just awesome. I love Dark Empire. I know a lot of people hate it because of how over-the-top force powers are. It also added a whole bunch of new ships, the Eclipse, the Sovereign, the Allegiance, the Tector. I like it. So the last two, I think, were novels in which there was huge expectation that they had to do these right, because these are two of the most canonically, philosophically important novels within all of Star Wars. So if there was going to be something that they had to not screw up, it had to be these two novels. And they succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. These are definitely the two best Star Wars novels, and they're two of the best novels I've ever. So, number 2 is Darth Bane, Path of Destruction. So this is the origin story of Darth Bane, the man who would eventually coin the Rule of Two. Now, once again, villain protagonist is always good, always fascinating. Darth Bane's an interesting character because in a lot of ways he's a tragic hero. He grew up in an extremely difficult, abusive environment that molded him into the man that he became. There's still admirable aspects of Bane even as he becomes a Sith Lord. He does have a lot of confidence in himself. He is extremely brave. So he's kind of a very admirable and fascinating character, even as he is exceedingly evil and cruel. So, firstly, Darth Bane is a massive Chad. He's 6'6", and because he grew up in the mines, he's absurdly muscular. But he's kind of more well known for his intellect. Scholar and a Chad. So, around this time period, I did a video on it, The Brotherhood of Darkness. The Sith had kind of reformed into their own version of the Jedi Order called the Brotherhood of Darkness. Now, the title Darth was banned during this time period, and instead all full Sith were called Dark Lord of the Sith, rather than there just being one. So all kind of Sith Lords were considered equal. The motto was, aren't we all equal within the Brotherhood of Darkness? So Bane despised this as he viewed it as egalitarianism, he viewed it as weakness. Now, the fact that the Brotherhood was united actually led to them being able to destroy the Republic. The Republic completely collapsed during the new Sith Wars, and except for Bane kind of intervening and screwing it up, the Brotherhood of Darkness probably would have won. So Darth Bane kind of throughout the book goes on spiritual journey after spiritual journey, eventually finding the Raqqa Prime from the KOTOR game. So he goes to Raqqa Prime, and there he finds the holocron of Revan, and from Revan he kind of develops the Rule of Two, only 2 Sith, one a master and one an apprentice. And I did a video about that, but it's kind of fascinating. It's a lot more intellectual than a lot of the other books. It's also just awesome. There's a scene where Darth Bane, when he's still in the army, he no-scopes people, I think it's like 12 people with a sniper rifle while blinded by gas. We also have some thought with a light whip. We have Shere Khan, who's named after Shere Khan. I forget, his name's probably pronounced a little differently. We have Lord Hoth. This is the time period where we had Jedi Lords, which is the most based form of government possible. It's just there's so much awesomeness crammed into these books. I don't really know. I can't really recommend it enough. The other 2 Darth Bane books I think are also good. That's the story of Darth Bane. Once again, extremely important. The Rule of Two, the foundation of the modern Sith, it really set the stage that would eventually result in Palpatine and eventually result in the fall of the Republic and the Star Wars movies. So it's hard to emphasize how important this is from a plot standpoint. After this, we have the Russian Reformation, where the Republic becomes like how we know it within the movies. We set the scene for the Sith's 1,000-year plan, a 4-dimensional chess to overthrow the Republic. We get to see the end of the old Sith empires. It's very important. Now, there's only one event that could possibly be more important in the history of Star Wars. And this number 1 book was probably the biggest opportunity to screw stuff up. Everybody knew this novel was going to come eventually. Everyone was expecting it, but I think a lot of people were kind of dreading it. They're like, this is pretty much the most important thing we can put in a novel form. The most important thing probably next to the movies. We can't screw this up. If we screw this up, the fans will never forgive us. If we screw this up, it's going to ruin basically Star Wars. And not only did they not screw it up, but they succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The best Star Wars novel, and honestly one of the best novels of all time, is Darth Plagueis. Now, we all know the tale of the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, and this tells the entire story of him, starting with the overthrow of his master, Darth Tenebrae, and he kind of leads the Sith Lords in their final push against the Republic. It's widely, he knows, kind of when he takes power, that he wants to end the Rule of Two. He wants He wants the Sith to come out of the shadows and rule the galaxy directly. He wants to overthrow the Jedi, etc. The one thing he needs, though, is a strong apprentice. He needs somebody unrivaled in the Force with considerable political acumen who's utterly lacking in a conscience that he thinks he can control. Enter Palpatine. This book is not only Darth Plagueis' background, but we finally get to see Palpatine's background. We get to see him grow from being a young teenager to becoming the Emperor of the known galaxy. And it's really cool to be able to see that. Palpatine's backstory had always kind of been a bit of a mystery to people. We know he came from Naboo. We know that he was from a noble family. But we don't really know too much about him per se. This book goes into all kind of very deep detail about his rise to power, about the politics behind the late Republic. It explains the role of the Trade Federation, it explains the Naboo crisis. It explains kind of all these fascinating things. A lot of other characters like Saint Pestage show up. It obviously tells the story of Darth Plagueis, who's an exceedingly esoteric and fascinating figure. Because while a bad guy, Plagueis isn't particularly evil. He prefers to bribe people or manipulate people or blackmail people rather than kill them directly. So he's a villain protagonist with kind of some admirable qualities, which often make for the best protagonist. Palpatine himself is excellent, and we can kind of see Plagueis seduce him, not literally, into becoming the man that he'll eventually be. What's kind of fascinating about this, and there'll be a couple spoilers, is you know how Palpatine says he could keep the people he loved from dying. The people who Plagueis cared about was his lab experiments, the people he experimented on. So he was able to use the Force to prevent them from dying when he was operating on them, which is hilarious. And Darth Plagueis the Wise is something Palpatine uses as an insult while killing his former master. So it's fascinating. It also obviously talks about the conception of Anakin. That's confirmed. It talks a lot more about the midichlorians. It kind of is a fitting capstone that fills in all the blanks. And I think a lot of people would say it's very risky to pull something like this, because what if it goes wrong? What if you completely screw up Palpatine's backstory and you just make everything more confused? But James Luceno succeeded beyond everybody's wildest dreams, and he made a fascinating book that has arguably probably the best vocabulary I've ever seen in a novel, probably at least one written in like the last 50 years. It's just an excellent Shakespearean kind of tragedy. I'd highly recommend it. If you're only going to read one Star Wars book, get Darth Plagueis, get the audiobook. It's great. Same thing with Darth Bane. Those are the two I'd recommend.